Hi everyone. In this video we're going to take just a minute to discuss the difference between observational studies and experiments. So this answers another portion of the how do we collect data, how do we answer questions with data. And these two types of studies tend to serve different purposes. So let's take a look at what separates them. So in an observational study, we can make observations, right? We can watch the subjects. If I'm doing a study of child behavior, I can sit in the room and watch how the children behave. I can take measurements. Right? I can measure the child's height, their weight, their temperature. What I am not allowed to do is I am not allowed to impose a treatment. So if I'm studying child behavior, I can collect data, observations, record age, height, weight, blood pressure. I can even collect blood for sampling. What I cannot do is I cannot introduce a treatment, such as requiring them to listen to a specific type of music, requiring that they adhere to a specific bedtime. I can't change the behavior of the system in any way. I am just observing the system and collecting data from the system. I am not making changes to the system. Experiments, on the other hand, I am going to impose a treatment, and then I am going to measure the response. So, for example, if I'm talking about school children, maybe I want to answer the question, does listening to classical music improve test performance? And so the imposed treatment would be classical music. I would have a control group of no music, so I had something to compare to. And then I would give both groups a test, one with no music, one with classical music. And then I would measure their test response. How well did they do on that test? So experiments, there is a treatment that the researcher am in control of, and then I am measuring the response in the sample. Typically those treatments relate to our explanatory variable, and the measured response is our response variable. And what experiments can do that observational studies cannot do is that experiments can provide evidence for cause and effect. Observational studies can support or provide evidence for a relationship between two things, but not a cause and effect relationship between two things. Going back to our children listening to music example, if I did this as an observational study, where I went into classrooms where students were allowed to listen to music, and I looked at the test scores and then sorted those scores based on which kids happened to be listening to classical versus which kids were not listening to any music. In that case, I might notice a pattern where the students who were listening to classical did better, And I would say that listening to classical music means you are more likely to do better on the test. Not that listening to music caused you to do better, just that if you do listen to classical music, we are more likely to see that you also did better on the test. Whereas if I ran it as an experiment, I took my 50 students, I randomly assigned 20 to listen to no music, I randomly assigned the other 25 to listen to classical music, and then I compared their test results, that would give me cause and effect. Listening to classical causes the improvement in test result. So identifying which type of study it is allows me to determine which type of conclusion I am allowed to make. In this course, we're not going to focus on this a whole lot. If you are taking AP Stats, we get into depth in this, but for your college course, not super important. It is something to keep in mind as you are reading studies. You need to be able to identify which type of study it was so that you can determine whether they made the appropriate conclusion type that goes with it. Observational studies can provide evidence for relationships between two things. Only experiments can support cause and effect claims. All right, if you have questions on the difference between these two types of studies, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in our next video on STEM plots.